Okay, so this is going to be your review of the Passe Composé. I'm going to do this in English because we're still new to the videos, but take notes, I'm going to use some terms in French. So remember, the Passe Composé is a compound tense, compound meaning two parts. So Passe Composé is two words, compound means two. So to form the Passe Composé in French, you always need two parts. Quelle surprise. So you need the verb auxiliaire and the participe passé. I went ahead and used the French terms here so that way you're used to hearing me say them when I use French in class, even though this video is in English. So your verb auxiliaire is a helping verb. Even though it's a helping verb, remember, and this will come up in a couple slides, that it really is important. And then a participe passé. So what are our two possible helping verbs for the passé composé? You can use avoir or you can use être. Now, the past participle is not the same thing as the infinitive. So you take the infinitive and you change it to a past participle. It's just that, it's a part of a verb that represents the past. So we saw regarder turn into regarder, and then or prendre as the infinitive, but the past participle is pris. We're helping verbs a little bit closer. There's two. There's avoir and être. So how do you know when to use which one? Well, let's start with être because that's easier. Être is only used for 17 verbs, your Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs that I have listed out here. I have them listed as the infinitives, but you might need to look up their past participles. But you also use être, if you don't remember this from French 3, and we'll be going over this in more detail later, you also use être for all of your reflexive verbs in the passé composé. So when do we use avoir? For every other verb. That's what makes it easier. Now, just to note, être, those Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs are on that list because they're intransitive. If you remember that from French 3, is that special I word. What does intransitive mean? It means that it cannot take a direct object. That's going to be really important later on when we study direct objects. Also, some of these verbs on the list can be both être and avoir depending on their meaning. So if you look at this example, you see j'ai sorti mon sac et je suis sorti de ma maison. Here, j'ai sorti mon sac has a direct object. I'm taking out my bag. Therefore, notice that I'm using avoir with that past participle. However, when I say je suis sorti de ma maison, I'm saying I left my house. So because it's now being used to leave or to go out of, I have used être as my helping verb. Here's just another example. Il a passé une heure au café, puis il est parti, il est passé par la bibliothèque. When we're looking here, passer, the first time is being used to spend time, so we used avoir because we have direct object. What did he spend? An hour. But the second time we see it, il est passé par la bibliothèque, we've switched to using être because passer means to pass by and no longer has a direct object. That's just a general guideline. A couple of the other verbs that do this are monter, descendre, and sortir. So taking a look at the past participles, although many are regular, there's still a lot of irregularities, so you need to memorize all your past participles. I didn't take the time to list them out right now, but I'm going to need you to look them up in your textbook. So the list of verbs that I gave you yesterday with the present tense, for all of those verbs you need to make sure that you know their past participles. So let's look at a few more examples, just putting it all together. J'ai pris une omelette à 8 heures. Notice we have two parts, a helping verb and a past participle. J'ai pris. Nous avons voyagé en France. Il a reçu une lettre de sa grand-mère. Ses parents ont vendu leur maison. For all of these examples, I've used avoir because all of these verbs are regular verbs, are not Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs, so we used avoir. But let's look at a couple of examples with être. Il est entré dans la salle de classe tard. Marie-Antoinette est morte pour la guillotine. Ils sont descendus du bus très vite. Elles sont rentrées à minuit. What you're going to notice about these examples is that they've made agreement with the past participle. I want to really stress that it is the subject pronoun, the person doing the action, that makes agreement with the past participle. That wording is going to be key later on in French 4 when we continue to study the passé composé. So the subject pronoun makes agreement with the past participle, but you should notice that it only happens when we're using être as our helping verb. So, ils sont descendus du bus, you get an extra S, agreeing with the il subject pronoun. Elles sont rentrées à minuit gets an extra es, paying attention to the subject pronoun elle, making agreement with that past participle. Because they're intransitive, because they cannot take a direct object, that is why they get agreement. So, if we're looking at the example that I gave you earlier, when we use sortir, two different ways. When we use sortir with avoir, we do not make agreement because of that direct object. But when we use sortir to go out of, je suis sorti de ma maison, notice that we add an I onto sortir because I'm using être as the helping verb. So the key is that être gets a little extra. We see that again in this example. Il a passé, puis il est parti. Of course, you wouldn't make agreement here because it's masculine, so it's kind of pointless to look at that one. Now, when we're looking at the structure of the passé composé, we also have to remember negation. So, when we see je suis arrivé à l'heure, we know that we need to put ne pas in here. However, we have two parts. Now, ne pas can only ever go around one conjugated verb. So when we're looking at the two parts, which part gets that gets that negation? Well, the thing to remember is that the helping verb, even though it's not really the primary meaning, is still doing all the work. The helping verb does all the work and doesn't get any of the credit. The principal verb is where the action is. That's where your past participle is, but it can't do anything. It's lazy. It needs that helping verb. So all that to say is when you negate, the negation goes around the conjugated verb, which is, in this case, the helping verb. So we're going to take je suis arrivé à l'heure, and we're going to negate it by putting the ne and pas around the helping verb. Je ne suis pas arrivé à l'heure. So looking at another example, vous avez fini le livre. Where is the ne and pas going to go? Well, it's going to go around the helping verb. So we're going to put the ne pas around avez and say vous n'avez pas fini le livre. So even though the two parts always have to be there together and they have to work together in order for the whole sentence to work, we're only going to look at using the helping verb for some of our structures that we need to make. So this is also going to be true when we use inversion. Remember, to the present tense, just reviewing inversion, tu voyages would become voyage tu. So we're switching the subject pronoun with the verb. So when we see the example tu as voyagé, which one of these is the verb? Well, even though they're both working as a unit, the a is still the helping verb. It's still the verb doing all the work. And so that's where we're going to look at using inversion. So notice I'm going to move the subject pronoun behind the helping verb. As-tu voyagé? Just look at a couple more examples. Elle est partie. Est-elle partie? Il a écrit la lettre. And notice for this one, we still move the il behind the helping verb, except we have two vowels, and so this is where you see that t come in. A-t-il écrit la lettre? So when we're looking at the passé composé, those are all the various structures that you're going to see. But what we want to call attention to is what exactly are we saying with the passé composé? Because there's a variety of past tenses in French and in English. So when we say j'ai pris, what exactly are we expressing? We are expressing I took, I did take, and I have taken. Notice we're not saying I was taking. That's a whole different tense. It's the imperfect. But here we can see that in English, just like with three different present tenses, we almost have three different past tenses in English that all fall under the umbrella of this one tense in French. But I would like to point out how complicated English is. I took, I did take, I have taken. That's really confusing. Whereas in French, it's a lot more simple. Simply, j'ai pris. Two parts, same parts every time. Notice that we don't have to switch it up like we do in English. So if we see another example, tu as lu, that would be you read, you did read, or you have read. And we're expressing all of that. So notice we didn't translate word for word. I didn't translate the helping verb necessarily into English. That's just what we say, they correspond to each other. And once again, point out how complicated English is. You say you read, but you did read. That's really confusing for someone who doesn't already know English. Examples, and then we're going to wrap it up. Elle est morte. This is one that's kind of an interesting example because when we go to translate it, we can say she died or we can say she has died. But we could also translate this to she is dead. Now when we do that, we're not translating word for word. You just wouldn't say in English she dead, like we could with some of the other examples. And one last example, elle est arrivée, could translate to she arrived, she has arrived, and she did arrive. Notice we're not translating the ich because you don't translate the helping verb necessarily. And so we would never say she is arrived. And you certainly wouldn't say she is arriving because that's the present tense. So that's why it's important that you don't look at it as individual words, but just look at the overall unit and then what are you trying to express in English. That's where yesterday's lesson on the present tense is important as well, so you don't mix up those things. Now, I want to point out that yesterday I said that the French don't use helping verbs in the present tense, but they certainly use helping verbs in the passé composé, and that's why it's also important to know the distinction. Let's just ask ourselves 3 questions, and you can even jot them down if you want, or see if you can answer them before I say them. But how many parts does the passé composé have? 2. What are those 2 parts? In English, you can say a helping verb or a past participle, but just looking at those French terms, verbe auxiliaire and participe passé, just to be familiar with them. And when do you make agreement? Now, this is something that I do want you to write down word for word, because it's not just to say, oh, when you use être. I need you to know specifically that you make agreement when you use être, but it's the subject pronoun that makes agreement with the past participle when être is a helping verb. So I want to emphasize that the subject pronoun, the thing doing the action, is what makes agreement with the past participle. And it's only when être is the helping verb. All of this is a review from French 2. We studied it, of course, in French 3. However, some of you, I'm sure, need to spend a little bit more time studying the passé composé, because as we move into more advanced tenses, it's really important that you have all of this memorized.